Pitch in, I'm also the PI for, left to my own devices, I'm a Professor of Computer and Information Security, so I've worked in security for about, I suppose, 30 odd years now. I used to work for a company called Logica. We only ever had one client in the West Country for about 5 years, and then I went to York and now I'm at Sheffield. Talking about smart city security threats and challenges, but I'm also the PI for Pitch-In, which is promoting the Internet of Things via collaboration between HEIs, that's universities, higher education institutes, and industry. I was not responsible for the acronym, I was just responsible for the bid. Smart cities, threats, security threats and challenges. It's a little unusual actually, this book. Okay. So the motivation for this is I want to talk about things which usually don't get very much coverage in smart cities at all. And these are the three things. So it's a collection of 3 topics, I freely admit, for a 10-minute talk. Digital twins, which are sort of the heart of a great deal of just general smart cities operation and research. Forensics is an issue, because that really is going to be an issue in smart cities and elsewhere. And something which has been known for an awful long time, which is what can you do with radio frequency that you'd rather people didn't, and that's vandalism. And that's something we're going to have to face up to when we're looking to use cheap equipment, and cheap circuitry in smart buildings and smart homes. So here's one I want to introduce, the topic of digital twins. Now digital twins, I'm not going to read all this out, you can go and look it up on Wikipedia as I did when I was searching for a very quick definition of what a digital twin was. Digital twins are, of course, everything to everyone. They're models, they're simulations, they're digital apparatus you can actually use to replace and model and improve and work with a physical operation to actually get data and learn how to run your system, modeling aspects of your systems. So let's have a look at it. It refers to digital replica, potential replica of physical assets. Almost everybody I know who works in smart cities, in research, actually ends up being involved with simulation or modeling or some sort of digital artifact, and often with AI and things like this. But what are the security implications for these things? Well, let's have a look. Well, here's a positive view. So I'm going to try to give positive and negative uses of these things. So here's how you can actually use a digital twin for security purposes. So here's a pretty straightforward problem. So if you have a set of attackers from somewhere on your network, a set of victims on the network, with the system doing its own routing, so this is how we've done the simulations, how would you actually best place your IDS, your intrusion detection probes, in order to give maximal attack detection? Or if you wanted to be a bit more refined about it, what information would you ask them to give under which circumstances? That is a system configuration issue, which actually different configurations lead to different levels of attack detection. So that's a fairly straightforward problem. You don't want data deluge, you've only got a limited number of probes. Where are you going to put them, and what are you going to ask them to do if you want to be a bit more refined? Well, by and large, this is how you use digital twins. You can actually simulate all these things. If you can simulate a profile of attacks, you attack your system, you would attack your smart city, you would, for particular configurations, you would monitor just how well your system configuration was performing, and there's a variety of optimization and other AI-based techniques where you can actually guide yourself towards what is, if not an optimal configuration, is probably a locally optimal configuration, i.e. a good security configuration for your system. Now, there are different things you can do. So you've got a threat profile here which you operationalize, i.e. you simulate attacks on your system. You've got your system digital twin. It's much better to do this than attack your own system. You can do it much, much more quickly, for example. And your policy, which is really your configuration, you would iterate and experiment, and gradually there are various techniques. You can just hone in on what seems to be an optimal or at least a high-performing configuration. So just basically use your twin to simulate behavior, attack it, and then see how your particular configuration responds. You can also iterate a little bit and say how sensitive is my system to changes in the assumed threat profile. Your threat profile is going to change over time, and hence you don't want a static configuration, or if you do have a static configuration of probes, you want to make sure that it is actually resilient to changes in your assumptions, that's a standard operations technique, incidentally, sort of sensitivity analysis. Let's run this right. Okay, so this is an example of a system which we're going to launch some attacks. So let me just say, this is just me picking 5 sensors or something. We're going to determine where on this rather simplified network. This is a glorious bit of eye candy, incidentally, which serves no purpose other than to amuse you while the system gets going. So what's happening is that you are seeing a simulation of an attack profile here on a certain number of victim servers. It's monitoring how many of these attacks are actually detected by probes at 5 places. The important thing here, if you can see it, is the red is suboptimal, the blue at the top is optimal. This is the number of attacks. This assumes you can determine from a packet, deep inspection of a packet, whether it's an attacking packet or not. And we've got 0.961 here. It's trying different configurations and changing one at a time. This is essentially what's usually referred to as a subset selection problem, i.e. which set of nodes should I place my probes at in order to get maximal attack detection. So there's an awful lot of suboptimal ones, but you generally notice here the trend is upwards, and in fact 0.974 for the particular attack is that's the percentage of attacks which have, that's the fraction of attacks which have actually been detected. And I know from trying this many times, and also the fact it's a simple network, you cannot do better than that. But behind the scenes, it's doing optimization of simple probe placement. Further work, I think, is to actually determine if you have a dynamic approach and you want more information on a particular information goal, what do you do? And can you dynamically alter your security configuration in order to maximize your current information goal needs? You can do work, you can try out massive numbers of configurations and do multi-criteria optimization. This is the false alarm rate going on here. This is that's the detection rate going up here. Not surprisingly, your detection rate goes up if you have more sensors. You're obviously going to detect more if you've got one probe, less if you've got one probe than if you have 7, etc. So you can use these sorts of techniques to actually do multi-criteria optimization. And that is actually fairly straightforward, provided you can simulate and provided you can actually get back the performance of your particular configuration. Malicious uses of a digital, that's positive. Malicious uses of a digital twin. Well, actually, digital twins lie at the heart of an awful lot of smart city operation. This is the idea anyway. An awful lot of smart city operation. And if that's the case, then anything your digital twin does, and you rely on it, is scope for an attack. Any expectation you have of your digital twin, which is part of your autonomic learning system, if I can break that expectation, you have a security problem. And the breaking of that expectation is the security problem itself. The malicious will want to break any or all of your expectations. And incidentally, if you can screw up the digital twin, that's a major security problem because most of your control system is actually running off your digital twin in one way or another. IPR may be significant, so I'm talking about disruption, but there's intellectual property also in your digital twin, whatever your system is. All right, autoimmune attacks. This is a slightly facetious, that we're putting it mildly, but also this is at the heart of smart cities. Various people wander around the country advocating self-aware, self-monitoring, self-loving, self-diagnosing and self-healing systems, usually called autonomic, or so that's old-fashioned, now called smart, etc., as if these were a good thing. And of course they are in some people's eyes, but actually there's a problem with actually having these sorts of autonomic, these smart self-reconfiguring networks at the heart of your systems, and that is they can be attacked. And in particular, there is work behind this, we've actually done some incidentally. You can consider the use of AI or optimization to discover smart jamming strategies. Most times if you jam, you just jam across the spectrum. Sometimes you can be a bit more specific about it. But actually, a little bit of jamming here, a little bit of jamming here, jamming there. For a very small amount of time, can you discover a strategy for how to dynamically and jam in a distributed way, which causes these reconfiguration mechanisms, these good, wholesome, I'm going to reconfigure to make the world better than it was. I repair what I think is a broken link, for example. You can actually use AI to generate a strategy which gives you maximum disruption for least effort. And that's what smart attacking is going to be. It's getting the maximum disaster, the maximum disruption for least effort, and it can be done. You probably will see more of it. So the thing is that, what's happening here is that if you cause autonomic mechanisms or smart mechanisms to be invoked to reconfigure, and again and again and again and again, the system itself can be induced to provide its own denial of service. So why bother Why bother creating a denial of service attack when you can get the system to provide its own denial of service itself? That's much more efficient. Of course, you have to give it a little prod via the micro-jamming, if you like, that's going on. So in general, autoimmune attacks, a system that reacts to its sensed environment or current disposition by reconfiguring or adapting in some way. That should sound familiar if you're working in smart systems, or in fact, almost any type of autonomous system. Presents an attack vector for adversaries that can manipulate that sensitive information. This is known in the military. You can try to persuade your enemy that there are tanks around, not by having tanks around, but just having a loudspeaker on the ground which makes tanks noises, and that's sufficient. You can manipulate their environment. Anything which responds to sensors is a potential attack vector, and that will hold in spades for any of the autonomic, smart, self-reconfiguring mechanisms which underpin bits of smart cities. I would like to give some thought also to forensics. So this is, loosely speaking, these are the identification, collection, organisation and presentation. Eventually, criminality will kick in. We are going gung-ho to try to create smart and pleasant cities for society, but it won't be long before criminality rears its ugly head, in which case you have the same problems with smart cities that you have with every other bit of IT that people choose to attack, is that eventually you've got to provide evidence, and that evidence has got to stand up in court. And this is where it all falls apart. Right? I don't know too many people who are looking at the forensics aspects of smart cities, and it's going to be problematic. That's not just you have to prove that things are tamper-proof and all the rest of it. There's a whole slew of information requirements that you need to look into, and also systems development requirements you need to look into in order to enable forensics. So it's not just about securing the data. The question is, what data do you need to secure? And that's where it gets slightly problematic, because the current approach to forensics, frankly, is various people do what they do, they log what they do, and at the end the police come along and say, can you prove that? What happened here? And can, from the scattered evidence all over the place, can you actually reconstruct the crime? That's not the best place to start, but it's generally how forensics works at the moment. What we probably need to do, in fact what we do need to do, is to work out what questions the forensics people, and there are a variety of people who have a forensics interest, would wish to ask, and then see whether we can actually craft the information that we actually store or can recover actually allows us to answer those questions. Now, when we talk about forensics, we tend to think about the police prosecuting whoever for whatever crime. There is another aspect to forensics, and that's a health and safety aspect. Can you reconstruct an accident in a smart city from a variety of information sources? And that may, or a smart building, if something goes drastically wrong, can you actually reconstruct the accident and why it happened? And that's also equivalent to a criminal investigation task. From a safety perspective, a health and safety perspective, determining whether you have sufficient information to actually reconstruct an accident reliably is a very difficult issue. And that's more about what you choose to log, where and when, than anything else. But that is a non-trivial issue, and I think you're going to be seeing more of those. Because accidents will happen, diagnostics will be required, and there'll be runtime diagnostics for managing the building. But diagnostics of a forensic, what happened, who did it, who was responsible, and when, is a very deep problem, and almost nobody is looking at this in IoT from a health and from a safety perspective, not just a security perspective. Drive-by shootings. I couldn't resist this. I thought, having introduced digital twins and forensics, what other disparate topic could I introduce? And I came up with this. So drive-by shootings. This may seem a little far-fetched, but once you have chips with everything, chips in everything, I tell you what, not only are they going to have chips with everything in smart buildings, in your home, in your car and all the rest of it, a significant proportion of that is going to be cheap chips. Cheap as chips, and it's going to be cheap chips, and cheap chips are generally attackable. From a long time ago, this Dorothy Denning thing I got up, which is originally what sparked my interest in what I describe as radio frequency vandalism. You used to get it by accident from your Hoover. If you took your Hoover up to your television set in the old days, you would induce interference. You can do much more now. But I won't go through the details. If you go off and read Dorothy Denning's book, you can rig together for a very small amount of money, 100 quid, probably cheaper, you can rig together induction coils. And you can actually point these things at vehicles, cars. The Swedish police did about 20 odd years ago, and they could, for 100 quid's worth of, and presumably a big battery, they were able to rig together pulse guns which, just around here, permanently damage cars. And this, presumably you're talking Saabs and Volvos here. It takes quite something to cause those to be damaged. And stop their engines at 90 meters. Just imagine what you could do if you walked past a smart building the chips in its fabric were not protected, not shielded. What could you do? And what's even worse, I mean, there are some things which are unlikely to get even in Sheffield, despite the TV history. So you're unlikely to get a nuclear electromagnetic pulse, but incidentally, if you want to cause havoc with digital equipment, forget about nuclear weapons are nasty. They're nastiest from a digital point of view if they're 200 kilometers in the sky, because the pulse will take out circuitry. So that's one of the things you have to take into account. But some of these other ones, they're cheap and they work. And your chips, your circuitry, a lot of it is likely to be unshielded. Radio frequency. Implications for smart buildings and smart cities. Let's just consider some of the tensions here. Does anybody work in what I've described here as an area of Wi-Fi friendly buildings, i.e. how you construct buildings so that Wi-Fi is best enabled or can be done very efficiently? Well, actually, I think civil engineering department here actually do, via digital twinning, actually have some work in that sort of area. But it's a perfectly reasonable thing to want to do, and there's a whole research area as to how you create Wi-Fi friendly buildings. Unfortunately, Wi-Fi friendly buildings and resilience to radio frequency attacks, probably not the best bedfellows, so you do have some trade-offs to be actually made. Transient disruption can be significant irritation, but really you're talking about people just, car goes by and your house is broken. Right? The circuitry has just been, burnt, essentially, one way or other. And you're all familiar with this because you all know if you go into a shop and walk out with something without paying for it, the alarm will go off. That's because somebody hasn't carried out a radio frequency vandal attack on the radio frequency identification tag. That's one of the approaches. You know, when they do this or whatever, they'll get the shirt collar and rub it over the vandalism device, which actually destroys the one bit which says this has not been paid for. Right. Shieldedness costs, but who takes this into account? I'd be very interested for anybody who works in smart cities to say, well, how much time over the past N years you've actually spent considering radio frequency attacks. And there is a link to forensics. I was looking for links between the various. What on earth would evidence look like? You pick up your phone and it doesn't work. There aren't any fingerprints on it. Your house doesn't work. Your city begins not to work. The evidence is? Well, the evidence is it's not working. You could do a hardware analysis and say, my hardware isn't working, it appears to be fried. But, as far as I'm aware, there's no equivalent of the ballistics forensics for a gun which says that bullet came from that gun. If you go along and say, I've got a fried phone or a fried wall or whatever, it's very difficult to link it to specific people at specific times. Whether or not what this means for going equipped, I mean, if you go out, I think the police can get you for going equipped with the intention of creating a crime. If you've got a crowbar in your back pocket, I'm not sure what the equivalent is in digital speak. You know, I've said hello, what are you doing with that coil and battery? I don't know what it means. The law is going to have to change. I say it could be digital equivalents. Who knows what bump keying is? Okay, I'd just like to know who these people are. Right, okay, right. Bump keying is essentially a way of actually getting into tumbler locks, so Yale locks, or quite often, and you just tap on the key, and the bits inside jump, and they create a space which allows you to turn the key. So it's a tumbler lock. The problem with this sort of thing is, one, it works on a hell of a lot of high security locks, and secondly, if all it takes is a special kind of key called a bump key and a hammer to cause the bits to jump to allow you to turn the key, then I'm afraid you have a problem. It leaves no evidence whatsoever. So at some point, you're going to have to consider radio frequency attacks, and you're going to have to consider what on earth does a prosecution look like, and how can we actually create the evidence which would back that up. And I think Yes, thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be delighted to take them.
Thank you very much.